right, launching right into business. So how have you been? I saw you interviewed Bog Beef. I got to watch that one.
Yeah, that was a
Um,
fun episode. I always, this is, I'm sure you're in the same boat where there's always guys that just slip through the cracks that
mhm.
you have a great time talking to them and then you check and you realize, geez, it's been like 18 months since I've talked to that guy. And that's being Bog Beef. I could talk to that guy for hours and yeah,
Yeah.
very fun episode.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I had a great time on the Good Old Boys podcast. It's been a while actually because people have been saying for years they should do something with them. But it was a pretty good episode. Um, yeah, Bog Beef is great. Him and Merrick. Merrick, how do you pronounce it? Merrick or
I believe so, yeah.
yeah, yeah. They're both
It's
great.
funny, Merrick's
Uh,
he's a pretty reclusive guy. Uh, but I think he lives in the same area of the country that a lot of my family is from. So just based off of context clues, I'm like, I think I know. And obviously, not in any sort of like threatening or doxing way, just the like you pick up on weird little context clues,
yeah.
and you're like, this is relevant information to probably like one guy ever who's listened to the show. But yeah,
Yeah, it's the same with people you discover live in Ontario. Um, but yeah, I I wonder, would you consider yourself a Southerner, Burden?
yeah,
Or
definitely. I
yeah,
mean, unfortunately, I've really had my accent stripped away from me by the internet and going to school and things like that.
yeah,
But I actually met up with a guy, mutual off Twitter. Turns out he lives a couple miles away from me, and he was describing the experience of going to a university as someone from somewhere and being exposed to these sort of like interchangeable widget people, right? Who are
yeah,
just as comfortable in kind of anywhere in the world as long as it's, a cosmopolitan city. And I think that really reaffirmed that identity, right? I am a person from a place. And I mean, look, this is a show, primarily about literature, but very much someone who resonates with the Southern tradition. I mean, even to the point where, my pseudonym is taken from a Robert Penn Warren novel, right? It's not, it's something that I don't want to say been grappling with, but something I've been interested in and thinking about for quite some time. And I mean, look, like, my particular area of the country, Virginia, is hyper represented in the online, right?
yeah,
Relative
yeah.
to other states. And
Oh, I wonder why. I wonder if the Langley. No, I'm kidding.
well, yeah, interesting. Gio, you may want to edit this because all I'm saying is my handler would be very unhappy if you disclosed that information.
Yeah, that's like how like Nophoids they like put Langley in their handle as like a funny joke, but even though like there's probably something to it. I mean, not well, I don't know. Like it's funny because the book we're talking about today, I guess you could say, um, in a virtual sense, does resonate with the idea of information networks becoming like an endless black
Hmm.
hole, and I was
Well,
reading. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
well, honestly, it reminded me very much of is it Rashomon, right? The Japanese film about a court trial, right? Where you
Yeah.
sort of you have every side of the story, and only at the very end do you hear a witness's account of it.
Hmm.
And that was sort of what I was thinking about, going back through this, is that it really like kind of flaunts I mean, and this is going to sound super chin stroking and douchey, but like the traditional modes of literature,
Hmm.
because there really is no omnipotent narrator. And in many cases, you're even the film itself, you're getting, a literary analysis of the film, or you're getting someone else's opinion on it. An academic, one of my favorite sections is like a feminist academic writing about, our main character's wife. And,
Mm.
all of these, you're sort of getting a side of the narrative. And I just want to say, Gio, I am not someone who tends to stand for a lot of like what I would describe as like pretentious nonsense in a book. And if you
Hmm.
described this to me, I would have bet you money I was going to hate it. And
Yeah.
nonetheless, I really enjoyed this book.
Yeah. Yeah. Even though, like, I mean, it really does for good and for bad, set a lot of trends within either like modern literature or like a lot of, I mean, well, it really is one of the first purely online books that created like a whole online canon. Like you wouldn't have the Backrooms, you wouldn't have Slenderman, you wouldn't have a lot of tropes in video games. But then again, I do think that House of Leaves did create the precedent for like a lot of abysmal Zoomer oriented cultural slop that we see on the internet. But at the same time, I mean, you can't really, I don't think you can really judge predecessors by the outcome of it. I mean, certain direct things, of course. I mean, a lot of people, for example, there are certain terrible, like I would consider the French Revolution probably the more mainstream reactionary position to be more or less correct. It did set like incredibly terrible precedences throughout human history. But at the same time, the things that led to the French Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, so forth, the American Revolution, there's a lot of debate between really chastising this narrative of like, okay, for both politics and culture, like, okay, if this didn't exist, then we would be living in a different world. But then you can't really say that because certain events, I think, do have a certain moment of crescendo in a period of history that makes them inevitable.
Oh,
so
definitely.
it's sort of, yeah, you can't like really judge a book by its the slop that comes after, I guess you could say.
Well, definitely, and it's sort of a similar thing you see with films like The Matrix is a great example, where as a Zoomer, it's sort of difficult to watch that film in the context in which it was intended.
Yeah,
looking back on it, it's a little bit cringe because you have in your mind all of the derivations of the original, which were much, much worse. And sort of in being copied, it has become cliched, even though the work in and of itself was original and interesting. For me, another example of that is Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah.
Look, like there's interesting stuff in Vonnegut. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan, but nonetheless, he has been sort of ruined by his imitators and ruined by the sort of people that read him. And this is a discussion for another time, but there is sort of a curse of accessible literature. You see this with the Great Gatsby and with Hemingway and stuff like that is relatively approachable, where it is oftentimes a midwit's first and only book. And so for them, it becomes all literature. And that isn't to take away from the the novel itself or the piece of art itself, but it is sort of a curse of online discourse about these topics. Whereas something like, House of Leaves, which is a incomprehensible tome graded on a curve, right? It requires some work. I don't want to say you have an advantage there because a lot of the analysis on it is very bad, but you are sort of swimming into blue waters, I guess.
Yeah. And hopefully the series that I'm doing is to correct this very sloppy analysis of that I think just doesn't go beyond the surface level of, ooh, gee whiz, wow, what if we had the Backrooms, but it was in real life? By the way, it is the Novice Record is set in Virginia too. I wonder if
it is, yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's sort of what would be, just from context clues, like what would be called kind of like Nova, which used to be more suburban than it is, or more rural than it is now. But it's sort of like the suburbs of DC, because there's a moment when they get an engineering professor from UVA, sort of the the prestige institution, which is Charlottesville, infamous for other occurrences, shall we say, and describes driving up from that. And Charlottesville is sort of the dividing line between like rural and northern Virginia. The rest of the state is very much a red state, where, well, sort of north of that, you get into actually a really pretty area where a lot of U.S. presidents had their homes. Montpelier, which is James Madison's house, is up there. But that is like rich person horse country. And then immediately after that, you get into sort of like megalopolis sprawl, which goes all the way up the East Coast. And so, judging from context clues, that's generally where it happened, which, given the social class we're talking about, makes sense. And also the fact that this is something that happened in the early 90s. So housing prices, not to beat a dead horse, were more achievable even then. But I think that in addition to the non-structured or the untraditionally structured narrative, which is obviously going to be where the meat of the discussion is, I think there's something else interesting, which is the sort of like upper middle class, what we would now refer to as like the laptop class, encountering something that is technically supernatural and being forced to engage with something that is not materialist. Because there's this great scene in the beginning when they first notice this door, when it's initially a very short hallway. And, you know, they're going through over and over, measuring it and trying to figure out, like, why is this space non-Euclidean, right? Why is there more space on the inside than the outside? And just over and over and over again, they cannot wrap their heads around it. And his wife, Karen, I'm awful with names, so I will get them wrong. It's kind of funny because throughout the whole thing, she does not understand the obsession. She just wants to sort of board it up and ignore it. But her husband has to, you know, measure it out, has to figure out, like, why is this thing not matching up? And so, you know, this is how we meet a lot of our characters, is that he is going around looking for someone to help him solve this mystery. And I think that there's sort of because our main character, I guess, is a photographer. And what is a photograph, right? But sort of taking a moment in time, right? Something that is like completely and totally material and happening. And obviously there can be a transcendent element to that. But it is interesting to see someone whose work is in the literal fact of reality wrestle with something that is outside of, you know, material reality.
Yeah. No, that's a great point, because I think that I never really, it's not made explicit, but it kind of is the sort of class distinction within House of Leaves between, I mean, arguably the two main characters, one being Navy, like Novitzon himself, but also Johnny Truant. Johnny Truant being like a low-life California bum, you know, working in a tattoo shop and being a total loser and coming from a broken home, and sort of like having a life of semi-criminality. But then also you have a very well-established, very professional jet setter type of correspondent and photographer in Novitzon, and how his attempt to wrestle with, like you were saying, a source of unknowing in a world that had become so reified in terms of life being figured out. But then as the house becomes deeper, as he descends deeper into it, his life sort of falls apart. It's discovered that his brother is also sort of like a semi-low life, or was like, you know, can't seem to get it together. His wife's cheating on him, who was wasn't she like a model or a movie star?
Yeah, although there's a really funny note in the beginning, which was obviously very relevant at the time, where it talks about her her career in film, and it says that she was friends with the Weinstein brothers.
It's
just one of those notes where, like, all right, maybe that, knowing what we know now, that sort of adds more to that reference, even if the author assumedly had no idea.
But it's very funny you mentioned like it seems that Virginia's a very integral part of the American story, right? And there's, I mean, not to be like total schizo posting, but I do get the sense that this exploration of infinite space in House of Leaves does crescendo nicely with a lot of the research that was being done largely by intelligence agencies, with, like, for example, the GATE program, cybernetics were integral to this. A lot of like Rand Corporation papers talked about the information society that was, you know, coming about. And I think like in a lot of ways, this book is sort of like a perfect metaphor for like the internet age, but also, I guess, the more nefarious elements of, I mean, what people consider like the deeper layers of the internet as such. And I wonder if there's a connection there.
Example of that is the Finders cult.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Which was
they were computer programmers along with Heaven's Gate as well.
Yeah, they were web developers. And that was off topic. Viewers research at your own peril. But
Flesh Simulator
that
has great videos on this as well, and Daryl Cooper. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, that was located in Culpeper, Virginia, which is like 40 minutes up the road from Charlottesville, which if we're talking the same general location, this is exactly like the general setting we're talking about. But yeah, so I mean, that's a sort of an interesting thing, right? That like, I think, one of the big Amazon data centers is, around there. Obviously, this is where all of the sort of the secret squirrel stuff goes on, is in Northern Virginia. So, I mean, I definitely think that is a connection. So I guess starting at the top, with our narrative, we have an intro, which is sort of talking about this, to use like a sitcom example, our A plot and B plot, introducing the B plot, which is, Zampano. I think that's how we say his name. I'm not a swarthy med, so I'm not exactly the person to go to on that. And then Johnny Truant, who is editing throughout the course of his narrative, constantly editing Zampano's work, which is talking about the Navidson film, which is the film that our technical main character, this photojournalist, makes about this house. And so there's another portion of this, which again, we're seeing a lot of analysis, which is a scholarly analysis of this film. And so this film sort of becomes like Faces of Death, where it was technically released in theaters, but is more kind of passed around and becomes a sort of touchstone of sort of like the literati, which is its own interesting commentary, right?
Yeah.
What does this class do when they are confronted with the transcendent? Well, they basically turn it into something to write PhD papers about.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
Also, there's some funny notes in the opening where they're basically saying like, it is, it's doubtful if most of these people have even seen a single frame of it, right? That it sort of becomes a thing to have said that you have seen. And it starts out as it's supposed to be a documentary where he's making a documentary about him settling down. He's been traveling all over the world, photo documenting, different disasters, and, it strained his marriage. And so he's moving back to this, quiet suburban area so he can live with his, his wife and his 2 children. And doing in this, right, he sets up these sort of like motion activated cameras throughout the house, which capture different moments. So for instance, like his kids playing, him interacting with his wife, moving in, which again lends an element of sort of like found footage horror to this.
Yes, I mean, this is the birth of found footage, by the way. Yeah.
Right.
Well, no, I shouldn't say. No, I should not say that. Cannibal H, was the beginning of found footage, in the 70s or late 70s. But yeah.
Do you know if the author has listed that as an influence or?
I think Danilewski. I think he actually did watch the film. Some commentary said somewhere, that was an inspiration.
So much glib commentary there.
Yeah.
So that is sort of our, the inciting premise, right? And Zampano wrote this sort of archetypal schizoid rant about this film. He is now dead. Our B plot character, Truant, is editing his work. And so through the course of his narrative, we see Truant sort of fall apart mentally, right? He's a drug addict. He's dating a stripper that he met at a tattoo parlor.
Yeah, Thumper.
Yeah. His
single mother stripper. Yeah.
His best friend, Lude, is sort of another kind of like archetypal low life. But the one thing
he's like Boomhauer. Yeah, he's a ladies' man. Yeah.
Yeah, is editing this work. And so throughout the whole thing, we see just all of these footnotes throughout the whole thing. And the typeface is different, implying obviously different authors.
Yeah.
And so, we have Zampano, we have the scholarly notes, we have Truant's notes. All of them, some of them seem to be fake, right? Just making stuff up. Some of them are to actual, documents. Some of them are, in-world documents. And they're all on top of each other. Again, when we're talking about non-traditional narrative, that really needs to be emphasized. You will have one chapter with sort of dueling perspectives. So,
Yeah.
for instance, you'll get the scholarly kind of literary analysis of the film, Truant's sort of stream of consciousness writing, and it will end in the middle of one paragraph, start from the other source, and then resume later.
Yeah.
And so
you also have snippets of academic papers throughout that are not real, but like are attributed sometimes to, like, here we have Camille Paglia, Jacques Derrida, Douglas Hofstadter. But we'll get to that. We'll get to some of the analysis is actually pretty keynote, So yeah, we'll get to it. But yeah, go ahead, Bird.
Yeah, and so just to kind of broadly summarize the plot, effectively, this room in the house starts to grow and develop, and we start to see more unexplicable things. Different noises happening. These rooms seem to shift and grow and change, and so our Navidson calls in an explorer, some of his friends, to basically delve the depths with him. They go down. It goes awry. One of these explorers, who I believe is in a wheelchair, and weirdly enough, there's this kind of interesting detail where the moment he was crippled was captured in one of Navidson's most iconic photographs. He has this photo of him right before his legs are crushed. Sort of starts to come unglued. He ends up shooting two of the other explorers, killing one, wounding another.
Not the wheelchair guy, the black wheelchair guy. The other there's I forget. His name. I forget his name, but he goes crazy in the room. And
it is. Let me pull up his name because I will get it wrong. Sorry, Holloway Roberts.
Holloway Roberts. Yeah, he goes crazy. Yeah.
And so point is, they escape. Navidson is sort of left down there. Much later, his wife moves back to the house, and under the assumption that he will come back. And this is sort of the part where, depending on who you read, if this sort of quote unquote actually happened or not, he does come back out, and the presumption is they resume some sort of life. Truant sort of spirals into addiction. We get letters from his mother, sort of concerned, asking about him, and then Zampano's death is sort of never confirmed one way or another. Some people, if you read the analysis, think that he is sort of a creation of Truant. It's debatable whether he was real or not. But yeah, so that's the broad strokes of the plot, just so we get that out there so people have an outline. But Gio, where do you want to jump in here?
Well, I guess to like finish off what we were talking about, like there is, like, I think the degree of madness that is experienced by Holloway is interesting in that it's a very not common, but it's a very like, it's a classic literary trope. I mean, obviously the allusion towards the Minotaur and in the maze that was then taken by, for example, Borges in various works of his, such as the Infinite Library, where vastness of information and vastness of space translates into a form of megalomania and madness. For example, the librarians in the Infinite Library, and I believe that was directly inspirational to Danilewski as well, the works of Jorge Borges, where it's like there's this part where he describes the librarians as being enthralled by sunset ideation because of their, for YouTube purposes, sunset ideation, if you know what I mean, by their confrontation with the Infinite Library. And so in a way, like I do make this connection to intelligence agencies and, for example, like Rand Corporation and other networks that were dealing with cybernetics and game theory and so forth, because it seems that like the confrontation with vast swaths of both data and physical space translate into the activation of some deep recess of the human psyche that is very ancient, but then sort of bubbles to the surface. I mean, obviously, like, you could take a Jungian interpretation of that, but I do notice it's very funny how the book is set both in California and in Virginia. Like, so you're talking about the whole thing with Laurel Canyon You mentioned the Finders as well, being in they had multiple locations, but in Virginia. And another connection with that, now that you've sparked my interest with mentioning the Finders, is that extreme childhood SA trauma is also affiliated with the book, both with Delisle, the little girl that Novitzin captures, which was the actual event of the starving African child that was that won the Pulitzer Prize in photojournalism back in 1994, and also the Karen, his wife, was also involved in extreme childhood SA, where I believe her stepfather would like put one of her siblings down a well and essayed them. Then she put them down a well and essayed her, and it was like a metaphor for this sort of like element of control through childhood trauma interacting with the darkest recesses of physical space. So I think that that's very, and also Truant.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah, as we explore with his mother, as me and Capitalissimo explored with the Wallstow letters, his mother also alludes to being abused in the insane asylum. So it seems like there's this pattern here that goes very deep into the recesses of the human mind that has a connection to trauma, information, physical space. So I wonder if take it away, Bern. That's a lot there already, but yeah.
Yeah, well, and that's sort of another interesting thing, that kind of the literal marriage of West Coast and East Coast in their marriage, right? That those are sort of, and have been sort of competing elites in different sort of spheres.
Yeah, right? Political and culture industry elites, yeah.
Exactly. And yeah, that's a really interesting connection I hadn't really thought of, right? And that's sort of another piece of analysis on this, right? Is the relationship of, I want to say Ransom, but that's the guy in C.S. Lewis. In, oh God, what's his name? Truant, excuse me. The amount of influence Truant's mother has over the document we are reading.
Yes.
We've mentioned the different font throughout the whole thing, and that's one of the things that is pretty constant, is that different speakers have different fonts. And I think hers, I don't remember what font it is, but it's a distinct font.
Yeah.
Appears throughout the whole novel, right? Even when she is not necessarily speaking or even has been introduced yet. And that's one of the things we see, is her amount of influence over Truant, right? We see this sort of like implication of, I don't want to say abuse in the same way, but of a very, very bad relationship between the two of them.
Well, the reason she landed in a mental institution is because she allegedly abused him as well. So yeah.
And again, right, that's that same way of like, there is this sort of degree of like childhood trauma and familial sin we see repeated over and over again through all of these characters.
Yeah.
Even in a different way, right? But Navidson's relationship with his brother, who is another interesting class dynamic, right? Navidson is this sort of like globe-trotting photojournalist, and his brother is like a local contractor.
Yeah.
And when they meet back together, right, even that family is broken. They don't talk anymore. And they sort of joke, right, this is the thing that brought them back together. But that is sort of an interesting theme running throughout the whole thing. And you could even draw a parallel between like descending into the well and like there's this scene, right, where there's this like, they basically have to lower themselves down into the depths of the house. And obviously that is a motif throughout classical fiction, right? The descent into the underworld and coming back out to be reborn. And obviously we have this sort of like dark and twisted version of that, but then again, right, doing the same thing with the house. I think is sort of an interesting motif to point out.
Yeah, and I mean, well, I mean, if you look at the political elites in Washington and Virginia, and you look at Hollywood, I mean, that of course, has a lot of parallels with extreme childhood trauma in both senses, and like descending the depths. I mean, of course, there was this dream that Novitzon had where he sort of goes into the underworld, and there's this well, and there are all these sort of like tattered clothes, like zombie-like spirits who are sort of trepidatious to go into this well because they don't want to be judged in the afterlife. It's sort of like a picture of Hades, or in any world mythology, such as in Egypt, like Anubis carries you off into the raft. Lo and behold, fast forward into, Dante's Catholicism. Again, you have the river Styx, you have crossing into Hades. And so in the dream, you have, I believe this dream was had by Novitzon right before he had to go back into the room to save his brother. And like, spoiler alert, he doesn't save his brother, but then he comes out a few months later, even though he's not subjected to thirst or hunger, or, I mean, nobody can live without water for a few months, but it seems that the distortions of time in the room is different, so
well,
there's sort of,
another interesting note sort of close at the end. He's still investigating this, and he brings back samples with him.
Mm-hmm.
And when he takes him to a laboratory, the lab tells him like, oh, this is older than the earth itself.
Yeah.
So it is, obviously it is technically material right there, touching and interacting with things, but it is very much something outside of the normal order. And again, it is sort of cliched when talking about this book to say like the house is a character, right? The house is alive, but there is like an animated force there, obviously, both because these rooms, these hallways are shifting, but also it seems to be a malevolent force, right? When it kills his brother, there's sort of a turning, right? It sort of, goes from being, like passive or asleep to like active and angrily looking for these men. And, one of the few things described throughout the whole thing is the sound of like low growling. It's just never explained. Again, indicating there is something sort of like living about this, that this is not merely like a pocket dimension or just some kind of like physical space, alternately connected, right? There's some sort of like primordial evil there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the way it was treated was way better than even like, for example, modern backrooms lore, where as soon as you insert this sort of, for those who don't know, like in the backrooms, there has been like developments of the lore where you have like quote unquote anomalies, which are like these physical Slender Man-like monsters that can mimic human voice. But in a way, like you were talking about the criticism of the Matrix, that was something that, even though it gave homage, the Wachowskis, do I have to say the Wachowski sisters nowadays? The Wachowski, for YouTube purposes, the Wachowski sisters. Oh my God, I feel so dirty even just saying that. If you know the lore behind the Wachowski, anyways, that's,
I think siblings is maybe
the siblings.
The most neutral way you can explain. That.
Yeah, the Wachowski siblings. Oh my God, the backstory behind the whole thing is insane. There's actually like passed around lore about this one dominate. Anyway, never mind. So in the Matrix, they give a huge.
I want you to know.
What'd you say?
I am. You know what? I'm just gonna let it go. I don't want to know.
Yeah, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it later. It's not appropriate. Yeah. There's. Anyways. In the Wachowski siblings, they give a huge homage to Baudrillard, but Baudrillard famously hated the Matrix. Right? There are other works before the Matrix that inspired the Matrix that are 10 times better. There's Cronenberg's work. There's Serial Experiments Lane. Like, you name it. There was even this other Japanese anime in the early 90s that was way better.
Speaking of that, you talked to Argent before?
Argent Templar? Yeah. I haven't, but we follow each other on Twitter, but I know. But I've watched his work for years, though, Arjun. So yeah, I should talk
to that
him.
guy about Lane. I've never seen it, but he did quite an interesting analysis of it. And I listened to it while I was working a factory job, which is like the most incredible dissonance possible. You know? It's like, I am the cog in the machine.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you talking about what we're actually supposed to talk about, but
Yeah.
you would make a very good guest.
Oh yeah, definitely. So they had this homage to Baudrillard where I believe one scene had simulacra and simulation, but Baudrillard famously hated the Matrix. He said it was a story the Matrix would produce. In other words, and this isn't me saying this is actually a great essay by Sam Kress. He said that in a way, like the problem with the Matrix is that it's a concretization of the actual concept of what Baudrillard was going for in simulacra and simulation, where it becomes this like fantastical Hollywood slop where I know that word gets bandied about so much slop, but we live
genuinely,
we live in the slop world, right? It's a concretization of a deep philosophic concept about the nature of human consciousness and information networks. And so I feel the Backrooms makes the same mistake by putting these anomalies in there and making it spoopy, scary, or whatever. Whereas in the room in House of Leaves, you don't physically see a monster. I mean, I know that Novitzon's brother calls it Mr. Monster. He starts goading the voice or whatever, but you don't really see a physical manifestation. Only the space itself becomes hostile. And I think that's a much more mature way of treating it than if they were to go into the rooms and it's like, oh, yeah, there's actually a Minotaur there. And there's actually a monster there. But no, the Minotaur is like you could say even in ancient Greece, the Minotaur is a reference, or rather is a metaphorical depiction of the space surrounding it itself, rather than like this sort of stupid Hollywood brain horror film. Oh, there's an actual monster down there, guys. Like, it's like, no, there's like the environment itself takes on a hostile character because you are dealing with something much more ancient than human experience or human consciousness itself. And so I think like to take that concept and to create this like spooky, scary, there's a monster that looks like Slender Man down there. It's like, it's sort of like the Matrix making a fool of itself by trying to create a very concrete, technologically based metaphor for the information society itself. It's like, yeah, something about like, I used to love the Matrix when I was younger, but like now that you think about it, it's like, oh, that's like, yeah, but I mean, anyways, let's not talk about the Wachowskis. But what are we gonna say, Burton?
So I actually want to compare this to Pan's Labyrinth.
Yeah, okay, that's a great comparison. Yeah.
Because we sort of have a similar thing, right? You know, there is a descent into this sort of, you know, like non-Euclidean world, right? We could say, you know, House of Leaves and Pan's Labyrinth are both sort of proto-isekai, if we want to use that language. But in actuality, it's sort of a different narrative. This is a very fun film to talk about because the whole thing is sort of like turbo anti-fascism.
Yeah, that's the whole metaphor is like a Pan Labyrinth. It's about fascism, yeah.
Right. And in that case, right, our main character actually finds this sort of demon, right, who's trying to get her to sacrifice his or her infant brother, I believe. It's been a while since I've seen it. But the reason I bring it up is because, and I actually think that Pan's Labyrinth is, despite the director's influence, a very good film. That he is sort of telling a story he is not aware of, you know, about, you know, the nature of true evil and the depths to which fascism is cast as the ultimate evil, even in response to an actual literal child-eating demon.
Yeah.
But the reason I bring it up is because you're correct in this case. Like the Labyrinth has no monster there, right? Like even when Davidson is rediscovered in the Labyrinth, you know, he's injured, obviously, but his injuries are frostbite, right? They aren't necessarily, you know, like a big bite mark or anything like that. And I think that that's sort of an interesting degree to which, like, there is a certain degree of personification of this house, but also all of the, like, a lot of the damage done is done by humans, right? Human nature, you know, shooting each other, you know, basically going, you know, sort of being stuck with themselves. And in that, that sort of Nikeia, right, descent to the underworld and then rebirth, we see at the very end of this film. I think it's very interesting that, his wife sort of rescues him, right?
Mm-hmm.
His wife she has refused to address this, refused to engage at all with this reality, but yet motivated by a desire to rescue her husband, she goes in, saves him. And again, this is classically speaking a comedy, right? Because it ends with their marriage. And that's an interesting thing, that before that they were not married. They were cohabitating. Yeah. It was sort of this, from the outside, idyllic liberal situation where you have
a very new and progressive
people,
white liberal type in the 1990s.
Exactly. Who are, unattached to each other. Navidson can go across the world. I don't know if it's confirmed, but isn't it heavily implied that Karen's had a number of extramarital affairs?
It could, and even the academic papers and various quote unquote radio interviews of Karen, she discusses her infidelity. Yeah. So they have like a semi-open marriage almost. Like it's
right, but she does.
She's into feng shui, and he goes around the globe. Like this is like total 1990s like white liberal paradise, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But she descends into this underworld, brings him back up, and then at the conclusion, right, this is ultimately much like the Christian narrative or like the classical comedies. It is brought together in a wedding, right? That is the conclusion of it. It is ultimately comedic in that sense. And what's especially interesting is that when they are married with children, it's in a completely separate third location, right? Like separated from both like the darkness of the East Coast elite and the darkness of this kind of like West Coast entertainment complex. It's in Vermont, which is in the middle of nowhere, right? No one actually cares about that. But it sort of reminds me of the role of, Beatrice in Dante is sort of the muse that can, lift the creative out of the darkness. That's not something he's able to do on his own. And I think that's a sort of fascinating note. It's also interesting just visually. And again, this is why I say, like, if you had shown me, just asked me to leaf through this book, I would have expected to despise it. Is that they do all this interesting stuff with typeface, where we see sort of kind of
it's concrete writing,
the twisting and turning of this maze. Text will be shifted one direction or biased all the way up to the top and left, kind of moving throughout. But so I'm curious. I guess that's a lot I've thrown at you, Gio. Is there anything you want to pull on from there?
Yeah, I think that the role of women is very interesting. I mean, of course, like modern critics could say that it's relying on quote unquote old tropes of the muse, but like, okay. But I think it's very important how.
Okay, shut up. Like whatever.
Yeah. But just to be fair, I would mention that criticism. But it seems that between Karen and Johnny Truant's mother, you have a very powerful feminine influence that, and I'll actually read you the critique here, the alleged critique by Camille Paglia. But you have to realize this is like the 1990s Camille Paglia, where she's seen as cool and counterculture before she's seen as like the Red Scare philosopher. So, no, but you have this fascinating connection where Johnny Truant's mother is clearly insane, but insanity in women is always translated in the ancient world to an oracle-like status where she can see reality or she can see through reality. And a lot of that is a product of trauma and a product of insanity. But insanity and trauma often does translate to greater psychical or spiritual connection and ability. And Karen is the same way. Karen Green and Novitzon's then future wife. So I do think that's a very powerful metaphor. So this is what Camille Paglia said. And Zappano, I think it's Zappano. But then I believe in the book, Johnny Truant tried to like write a letter or tried to like call Camille Paglia, and Camille Paglia told him to like go screw himself. Like, what are you talking about, this stupid film? I could just imagine her Italian motor mouth just like going up. So here's Camille Paglia setting the Bowery Bar patio. Paglia, notice only men go into it. Why? Simple. Women don't have to. They know there's nothing there and can live with the knowledge, but men must find out for sure. Like, I'm not going to do the Paglia voice for like, I can't do it for too long. So they know there's nothing there and can live with the knowledge, but men must find out for sure. And so, again, like your point, Karen only cares when she becomes the sort of like redeemer, savior woman archetype, right? She becomes she becomes the mother figure in its more positive position rather than shadow self. They're haunted by the infinite hollow and its sense-making allure, so that they crave it, desire it. Desire is ending, its knowledge. It's used to hear it a strange Lovian phase, its essence. They must penetrate, invade, conquer, destroy, inhabit, impregnate, and if necessary, even be consumed by it. It really comes down to what men lack. They lack the hollow, the uterine cavity, any creative life yielding physiological incavation. The whole thing's about womb envy or female anatomy envy, whatever you prefer. Karen is actually interviewing Camille Paglia. What about my character's fear of darkness? Paglia says, pure fabrication. The script was written by a man, right? What self-respecting woman is afraid of the dark? Women are everything that's the internal and hidden. Women are darkness. I cover some of this in my book, Sexual Persona. Dude, I would never imagine Paglia making a plug like that. Due out for vintage in a few months. It's so stupid. She would never plug her own book like that. I don't think so. Like, it's such a shameless way. But
honestly, I think that there is something to Paglia's critique there.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Fundamentally, I think that the reaction of Karen to this whole situation, which is to accept the unknowable, right? To accept this sort of like, obviously the feminine is associated with the lunar, right? The lunar with sort of like the unknowable waters.
Yes.
Right. And so there is like an inherent mystery both to feminine character, but obviously on the simple, like, emotional level, as, anyone who's ever, spent a lot of time with a woman will know, but also on like a biological level, right? That there is a hiddenness to them, right? The womb is hidden from them. There's a certain aspect of, their own fertility that is indefinite.
Yeah. Men don't know what's going on there. We don't have an idea.
And so, I think that that's an interesting reaction. The male desire is to, and you can call me out if I go too far here, but right, to basically like to descend into the darkness and cast it out, right? To bring it into the known. Whereas Karen's reaction is basically to say, like, it's unknowable, right? This is not something to be examined. And I also think it is interesting that you have the sort of the comparison and contrast between the two mothers in our A and B plot, right? You have Karen, who sort of becomes this redeemer character at the very end, despite obviously her. And actually, speaking of that, it's interesting that in order to become that redeemer, she has to brave the fear of the dark. She has to descend into that well again, right? Which harkens back to her earlier traumatic event. Yeah. And that is how she is able to do that. And contrast that to Truant's mother, right? Who is obviously also has a history of, abuse, to put it mildly. Mm-hmm. She remains the smothering mother, right? She remains the sort of
consuming mother. Yeah.
The consuming mother, right?
The Jordan Peterson, consuming mother. Yeah.
Which, if we're talking about another version of the same story, we have Coraline, right?
Oh,
Damon, which is sort of an interesting situation of another sort of descent into, an alternate reality. Now, admittedly, there is the monster, the beldam, the all-consuming mother, but nonetheless, sort of a take on a similar, I guess, like motif there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It even recently comes up in 28 Years Later with Spike and his mother. What's her name? Cormier. She's like dying of cancer, and he has to go and find the doctor. And then there's this one scene where where one of the fat crawlers comes up and like almost, gets him, but then it's discovered that she wakes up in the middle of the night and, caves his head in. There's obviously like madness. And I mean, listen, I know, just to play devil's advocate, just to be totally fair, I know it's a common trope. I know like a lot of feminist literature critiques this, but there is a historical connection between madness, femininity, but great spiritual insight and redemption as well. And for example, like even before we were talking, I saw this on the For You tab on Twitter. I saw this video. It was these young, like college age girls, and I think they were at some kind of like summer vacation house or whatever. And they discover this secret room that was behind a kitchen cabinet that you had to like, it was like one of these hidden rooms, and like they go in, like there's a stairs, and immediately as soon as these girls see the stairs, they lock the door, they close it, they're like, we're not going down there. But I'm thinking, like, if it was a man, they would make the stupid decision to like take a flashlight and go down there. And like, if there's some like crazy homeless man down there or whatever, right? Like that's happened before, houses that people buy. But I'm thinking like the women, they're like, okay, yeah, it's a room. Who cares? Like, it's like, we're not going down there. And you could say it's cowardice, but there is something of like, not to say that like women are incurious, obviously, but it's more of like, I think women are more attuned to a more natural sense of danger than men. I mean, that's pretty obvious. And I think like the whole arc, I wanted to actually talk about this with you because there's the three interpretations of why Navy goes back to save his brother. But I wonder if like Karen is more comfortable with not knowing because by definition, it's not knowable. Whereas a man has sort of like a weird, almost stupid delusion of like, I need to know this. We got to find this out. We got to go. Like, it's insanity, but I think like a woman's insanity and a man's insanity can come off as quite different in a lot of ways. And so I wonder,
I think that's actually an interesting thing. The comparison between Zampano and true insanity, which is this sort of like obsessive desire to know and catalog everything.
Yeah.
And the insanity of his mother. And I think that to your point about that comfort with the unknown, because ultimately like the feminine contains an element of mystery and the unknowable in it. It's sort of baked into the cake. Whereas, I mean, even the fact that like what Nabenson does is go to a place and make it known to everyone, right? He takes a photo and then publishes that. Is that idea that, which going back to the materialist conception of the managerial class, right, is the idea that everything can be explored and categorized and brought into the world of fact and figures.
Yes.
And when confronted with something ultimately unknowable, something outside of measurable reality, well, how do they react to that? And it's interesting because it sort of is a one degree, like the feminine is more equipped to deal with that, but also our heroine must also do something deeply uncomfortable, right? She must, instead of following pure instinct and retreating from that, must venture into it, right? Expose herself to it, and then redeem Navidson. So I think that perhaps there's like a low IQ anti-feminist reading of this. It's like, he was just saved by a woman, which is very much not true, right? Like Karen is obviously a sympathetic character, but it's very clear that there are things wrong with her.
Yeah.
She's
Definitely
not this kind of like idyllic, perfect heroine. And also, right, she is required to do something dangerous and uncomfortable in order to save her husband and act heroically. Right? This isn't simply something innate to her.
Yeah, exactly. I think like both the feminist and anti-feminist critics have serious problems with analyzing this. I mean, Karen, we have to realize, is also a product of extreme childhood trauma, and being put down a well where your sibling is being essayed, you being essayed, and then their sibling going into a well. I mean, for her to overcome that, when previously the marriage was, it wasn't a marriage, it was a relationship on the rocks. She was, cheating on him, and he was going off, and he knew and he didn't care. To like then break through the sort of pretension of like modern bourgeois life, as sort of like, like what would Michael Savage say? Like a key sheeting class. That's what he would call them. Back if you ever listened to Michael Savage, like the key sheeting class, to like break through those pretensions of very safe bourgeois life to inhabit something more ancient than that. I think does take a huge feat. But to read further, so this is there's a summary of all the different artists and academics. So they even interviewed Kiki Smith. I quite enjoy the works of Kiki Smith. Great, amazing, like totally 1990s body horror type of art, contemporary art. So Paglia says, what would I describe as the feminine void? And of course, and here is Jacques Derrida, who said, well, that was what is inside, which is to say, if I may say, that which infinitely patterns itself without the outside, without the other, though where this other is. Then he said, hold my hand. They take a stroll. Then Derrida says, what else? They interview even Stanley Kubrick. The other, pause, so he pauses, or what other, which is to say then the same thing, the other, no other you see. So in other words, Derrida says like the room is the total obliteration of the other, right? Which I guess is a stereotype of Derrida's work. But then Stanley Kubrick, which I believe he wasn't, when did he die? In 96? Or in after, it was during Eyes Wide Shut, so. Right? Yeah. When did he die? I think he died right after he made Eyes Wide Shut.
99. There
you go. And this is set in 95, I believe. So then Karen's interviewing Stanley Kubrick. What is it, you ask? And I answer, it's a film. And it's a film because it uses film and videotape. What matters here is how the film affects us, and in this case, how it affects me. The quality of image is often terrible, except when Will Novitzon handles the camera, which does not happen often enough. The sound is poor. The elation of many details contributes to the insufficiently developed characters, and finally, the overall structure creaks and teeters, threatening at any minute to collapse. That said, or in this case, typed, I remain soberly impressed and disturbed. I even had a dream about your house. If it didn't know better, I'd say you weren't a filmmaker at all. I'd say the whole thing really happened. Well, I mean, it's funny the filmmaker of filmmakers says, well, actually, it happened. And then Kiki Smith, who is a great visual artist, says, where is she? Oh, they even interviewed Stephen King. But Stephen King has nothing to say. He's like a total, he's like, you didn't make this up, did you? Studying Karen, I'd like to see this house. And that's it. Because Stephen King has no creativity whatsoever. You can't compare these other ones to Stephen King. And then Kiki Smith says, where is it?
Well, that's almost a
go ahead.
Interesting inclusion in and of itself, right? Sort of taking in that sort of the key shooting class, right?
Yeah,
it is a lot of people who you were supposed to have read because they are, the sort of kept intellectuals of the era, and then also like Stephen King, which is just like on the Oprah circuit, but is very much another kind of like part of culture in that class. Mm-hmm. The kind of like the mix of NPR intellectuals and then also kind of like, pop. I don't want to say Americana, but like American pop culture.
Yes,
I think that's almost an interesting inclusion, right? If you hadn't have been there, it wouldn't have been the same kind of like insightful pastiche of those people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You also have like Douglas Hofstadter that talks about the non-Euclidean element, similar to Zeno's arrow, considering the following equation. I can't read that equation. If we apply this to your friend Bloom's Poetics, we get an interesting perspective on the monster. Let one mean the artist that so again, he's breaking everything into math. And of course they interview Harold Bloom, and he talks about the anxiety of influence and so forth. But here Kiki Smith says, well, gosh, without color and hardly even any gray, the focus moves to the other stuff, the surfaces, the shapes, dimensions, even all that movement. I have to say it comes down to the construction, the interior experience, the body sense there, which, well, gosh, what makes the whole thing so visceral, so authentic. And if you know anything about Kiki Smith's work, you know that it's all about the textural elements of the body writ large at its most granular and biological detail. And I think, I mean, in some ways, Danilewski's writing sort of like very stereotypical responses of all of these academics and thinkers and artists. But it does, like, he even interviews Steve Wozniak. Why is Steve Wozniak there? Why Steve Wozniak? Let's see what Steve Wozniak has to say theoretically. Sure, I agree with King, an icon for a bridge game. It's symbol for the program, the data, and more. But in some respects can also be looked at as the bridge game. The same is true with this house you created. It could represent plenty of things, but it also is nothing more than itself, a house, albeit a pretty weird house. And again, you know, visionary computer programmer sees that connection. So, but then Stephen King says, symbols, schmimbles, sure, they're important, but well, look at Ahab's whale. Now, there's a great symbol. Some say it stands for God, meaning and purpose. Others say it stands for purposelessness and the void. But what we sometimes forget is that Ahab's whale was also just a whale. And there you go, Stephen King. Nothing means anything. It's all just schlock monsters. It's like, oh, but by the way, when it comes to critiquing the Bible thumper crazy woman in the mist, then it means something. Not anything else, though. So it's like, you know, I don't believe in anything, man, but I believe in that. So I believe Trump is the next Austrian painter. It's like that is a great critique of Stephen King, though. I think that there is a certain trend within American literature that comes from like new journalism even before that, where I guess you could say with Hemingway, where it's like, you know, purple prose is bad, metaphor is bad, symbolism is bad, just get to the story sort of deal. So I don't know, would you confirm that, Burden, as an American? They even interview Anne Rice. Of course, she alludes it to sort of dark actuality. Darkness isn't male or female. It's the absence of light, which is important to us because we are all retinal creatures who need light to move around, sustain ourselves, and protect ourselves. George Foreman used his eyes much more than his fists. Of course, light and dark means a lot less to a bat. What matters more to the bat is whether or not FM frequencies are jamming its radar. So, yeah.
Yes, I want to go back to the fictional quote by King, because I think that's an interesting, and you could almost look at this as the author sort of baking in and addressing criticism of his work, right? You know, taking kind of like, shall we say, like well-established avenues of critique, and I think that's, to your point about, you know, King having, shall we say, motivated reasoning on certain topics. Interestingly enough, actually was born Stephen King and apparently was raised Methodist. I'm not saying that ironically. I was surprised to learn it. But point is, right, he is someone for whom, despite writing about fantastical situations, he is at root a godless materialist.
Yes, 100%. Yeah.
And you compare that to a story in which, okay, sure, there is no, you know, spooky, scary monster, but it is very clearly like a tale of the unknowable, you know, a tale of, you know, the supernatural. And I think that's a really interesting critique, right? You know, the hypothetical King basically saying like, well, maybe it's just a maze. That's all there is to it. And I mean, sure, like that I think very much is the flaw we see in sort of like backrooms lore, right?
Yeah.
You know, it just simply is like a scary tale for a monster stripped of any sort of claim made about human nature. But I think weirdly enough, it's almost like that line from King is exactly what we see in the slopification of, you know, works like this, and then also, you know, you mentioned The Matrix as well, which is basically, you know, a transformation from, you know, a device used to make a claim about humans and their nature to, you know, a mass entertainment product. And I mean, King, despite writing books, is an entertainment product. And this is really off topic, but it sort of reminds me of the like general liberal feelings on just books generally. Yeah,
media literacy.
Like, yeah. Where it's like, oh, well, just read a book. You know, a book in itself is something like sacred and special, and you're a good person for having engaged in them. but like King's works are literally slop. You know, okay, they may be well-written slop in certain instances, but like it is fundamentally a literary version of a roller coaster ride or jangling keys in front of your face, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that that's sort of an interesting point, right? It tells you more about King and the men like him than anything else, that they view all of this as simply like a transaction where it's like, I produce entertainment and am compensated directly for that. I don't know. I think that's an interesting tangent.
No, I mean, it's the same with anything. It's the same with Star Wars. Like, can you see any of like the numerous Disney franchise versions where it's like, I'm having a brain fart. Martin Scorsese was 100% correct when he said like modern films are basically amusement parks nowadays. Like any of like, you could still pick apart some very vague, very like reduced residual version of cultural memory that is related to the original basis of what, and I'm not an expert in Star Wars. This is secondhand because I've never watched the whole thing. But the modern spin-offs, you can reduce it down to anything to do with the original thing that George Lucas had in mind, which comes from Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, right? And comes from that influence. But I mean, it's so reduced down to like, okay, let's have this badass Mary Sue character in this far off like planet that nobody cares about, that's like maybe mentioned once. And it's like, let's have a whole spinoff, and then this spinoff, then Andor, then this and that. And it's like, it goes on, even though there's still enough zombified elements of the cultural canon, the Western canon that Bloom talks about, where you have very deep archetypal forces. There's still a little bit enough there for the culture industry to keep like shuffling along like some kind of upteenth iteration of Walking Dead zombie. That's like, like, I mean, even The Walking Dead is like an example of that. Like, original story, first few seasons, crazy, amazing concept. But then, after a while, it's like, how many boss fights can you have? And yeah.
And it sort of reminds me of something actually also relevant to kind of late 80s, early 90s culture, right? Which are zines, which are sort of constructed by kind of making a collage, photocopying it, and then, producing it.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is with each subsequent photocopying, it's more and more, the quality is diminished.
Yes.
Right? You lose some of that resolution. And, when we talk about stuck culture, or civilizational winter, whatever you want to call it, it very much is that process of, copying something again and again and again until it loses all defined edges, right? It just becomes a mass of gray. And, I think that that's a very observable thing, right? Star Wars is a great example. I'm kind of with you. I think I've seen some of the movies, obviously the originals, and then the new ones. The last one was a lot of fun. I watched it somewhat intoxicated and remember at least some of what happened. So, I'm not going to pretend to be a subject matter expert, as they say. But nonetheless, you see that very much like a Red Letter Media uses the term, right? Like member berries. Like, oh, don't you remember this thing? And that becomes the attachment. It's not an attachment to something that is, good or interesting or iconic. It is sort of a shadow of that, reflecting that nostalgia of, hey, remember that one time you saw something you liked. This is sort of like that. And yeah, I think that that's an interesting diminishment, right? It is no longer the work in and of itself. It is sort of a remixed version of previous things, which goes back to the recent discussion about, like generative AI or whatever. That is very much like the sort of the extension of that, where everything is simply a combination of previous remixed things.
Yeah.
It's taking the training data, the conversations that people had, remixing them into responses, or it's taking images you may have seen and remixing them. It's completely and totally, I guess, kind of iterative in that sense, where, everything is downstream of something else. And again, to the point of like, talking about this and the things that have, come from it, right? You see that same diminution of quality.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, House of Leaves is great. Okay, maybe the first like SCP about, you know, the back rooms was pretty decent.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's gotten to like, you know, YouTube bait jump scare video games where it's like, okay, there's really nothing there past a, you know, a number of motifs that have been associated with previous things.
Yeah.
And I think that that's
They got the Waterworld level, the Funhouse level, the childhood birthday party level. Like, yeah. Yeah.
Right, where it is simply sort of a, you know, a remix upon a remix upon a remix. And yeah, I don't know. I think that that's sort of an interesting trend we can see, because oftentimes when you talk to, you know, cinephiles, they will bemoan the 90s, right? They will say this was sort of a, you know, a great era of awesome movies, and everything since then has been crap. And they're not wrong. Like, don't get me wrong. They're really not wrong. But they are sort of, it is sort of upstream, right? The problem isn't simply that cinema got bad. The problem is that, you know, American culture lost, or world culture really by extension, ran out of the fumes of a previous living culture. So you mentioned, right, like even Joseph Campbell is pulling from the entire Western canon.
Yeah.
It gets sort of transmuted into a, you know, a goofy space opera from the 70s, which then in turn becomes, you know, photocopied and photocopied and photocopied until, to your point, right, it's sort of a scowling, you know, Mary Sue character, you know, quipping about how much men are stupid and ugly, but we did it again, right? We have the Millennium Falcon. You know, we have the echoes of that, you know, resident hero's journey. And I think that that sort of feeling of running out of steam, right? That feeling of losing the engine of culture that drove new and interesting ideas is what shows that we are in this kind of civilizational winter, right? Nothing is green anymore. And even the fall, right, which was this incredible explosion of color ultimately coming from the death or the cessation of that process was beautiful, but it was fleeting. You know, eventually the leaves fall. And wherever you mentioned the French Revolution, if you want to see that as, you know, the high water mark, right, the moment when that society started to sort of tear itself apart, regardless, I think that we could sort of see ourselves as like sort of straddling the line when the fumes ran out, right, when that sort of violent burst of creativity sort of slowly came to an end. And that doesn't mean that there isn't good and interesting art, but even the fact, right, that this is all communicated through analysis, like over and over again, taking a creative thing and pulling it apart, weirdly enough, going back to our theme of like taking something out of the human and the unknowable and bringing it into this sort of measured scientific world of analysis is sort of a sign of that, right? This is no longer like academia, literature is no longer about the creative. It is about, you know, analysis and comparison and, you know, sort of in a weird way, this kind of like destruction by analysis where you...
Thank you for listening to the Content Minded podcast. If you wish to support me and listen to every episode in full, then please go to patreon.com/giantartproductions and substack.com/Gio's Content Corner. There you will find the full archive of every Content Minded episode, as well as every Giant Art Review episode, and exclusive to all patrons, the weekly Cole Report, where I break down interesting stories and discourse from throughout the week. Subscribe today to keep the content renaissance alive.